thing I want to do is say thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. This is a really weird talk, and I understand that. Why the hell would someone ask what is an artist talk? It's a strange sort of thing. But for me, artist talks in and of themselves are kind of weird. I mean, I oversee artist talks at the museum, but there's a large part of me that doesn't quite understand why we do them, that has a lot of issues with them, but simultaneously I love them, and I love listening to artist talks, and so I'm in this kind of in-between space, and I don't quite know how to handle it. And so I was actually, for Dallas, I was asked to talk about what I do for programming, and instead of doing that, I said, could I talk about what I think an artist talk might be, or why the hell we do it, and they said yes, and then John invited me down. So one of the main reasons that artist talks are weird to me is that they don't have a history. So a lot of other things related to art, I mean, there's all kinds of versions of art history, but even curatorial histories at this point. There's all kinds of arts writings. I mean, there's like 3 damn volumes of Van Gogh that you can buy, of everything that he wrote to his brother, but there's so little available for what artist talks were. Now, some of that was recorded in written form, but it's really different than seeing an artist live. And I wondered why that history didn't exist. Like, there's a strange thing about why we don't have that history. And the other thing is, obviously, artists have not always been asked to talk about their work. We ask artists to talk about their work all the time now, and there are millennia where they weren't asked to talk about their work, but now we ask them to talk about their work incessantly. We ask them to talk about their work, not only in artist talks, but also in interviews, all these different kinds of formats. But we're constantly asking them to explain their work. Nathaniel's in here.
Sorry.
Another thing that's weird to me about artist talks is institutions don't really know what to do with them. So this is really inside baseball, but I'll say, so as an institution, the Contemporary Arts Museum is always looking at what other institutions are doing. So for instance, we're looking at the ways that people use different kinds of language in their hires. And it sounds really boring, but it's super fascinating to us. So as a, for instance of what I'm talking about, I think it was the Whitney, I know for a fact that the Walker did this. The new person that they had for education was director and curator of education and public programs. Now, I'm not a curator, and I actually never want to be, and it's nothing against curators. I actually really like curators. But I'm wondering why they need to put that in there. So, in public programs, there are a lot of inner fights, not in our institution, but I know of in other major institutions, of different departments trying to snag public programs. So curatorial is trying to take public programs, education is trying to take public programs. They're all kind of fighting over this weird domain. Part of it is they have very different views of what these things are, but it's an unusual situation. So in any case, what I want to do is I want to talk about 4 ways, since it doesn't really have a history, I want to talk about 4 ways in which I see other kinds of histories interacting with this thing that might be the history of an artist talk. So I want to talk about moving images. I mean that really broadly, so that encompasses, you know, film, video games. I mean, you name it, GIFs or GIFs, depending on how you want to say that. Hermeneutics, which I'll explain later, performance, and pedagogy, just education. So I think all these things kind of interact to make this thing that's the artist talk. And then a bunch of other things that I won't talk about today because I want to try and hit 30 minutes. So first and foremost, moving images. And we'll start at the beginning in 1656. So this gentleman who has this kind of 80s hair metal look to him, is a really interesting guy. He invented the pendulum, or he did a lot of experiments with the pendulum, but he also invented something called the magic lantern. And so what the magic lantern was essentially, it was the rudimentary version of what I have next to me here, a projector. So what you do is you have a slide, I don't know if that's what they called it back then, and you'd have a light behind it, and it would shine and project out. And almost immediately when they made these things, people figured out ways to make money off of them, which I really appreciate. So for example, there was this gentleman, E.G. Robertson, who would go around and he would, and there were a lot of other people like this, kind of tell these ghost stories. And film already has this kind of weird, ghostly, sort of scary presence. I mean, there's all kinds of stories about the beginning of film sort of frightening people. And then there are larger ones. Albert Smith, he did this thing that was essentially a photo play called The Ascent of Mount Blanc. And he was doing it throughout the 1850s. And basically what it was is it was the first sort of family travelogue or family sort of slideshow. So he went on this ascent of this mountain and he got all these images, not photographs, but images, and then he projected through and he would talk about this journey. And as boring as that sounds, you can see from the engraving that a ton of people showed up to this. He was hugely successful. He made a ton of money off this thing and he kept making it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And he wasn't the only one. There was a lot of people around that time doing this. So a lot of these men who were doing this at that moment, they were basically nomadic. So they would throw their magic lanterns on their back and they would go from town to town and they would do these different kinds of shows. And I couldn't help but, I found this image and I couldn't help but equate it to this Courbet image, which is a beautiful painting. He's a really underrated painter. Just in this kind of traveling nomadic sensibility. With this method of comparison, actually what I just did here, that has a historical precedent. In this art historian, who's really well known for doing something called the principles of art history. So the differences between the Baroque and the Renaissance, what he would do is he would show two slides simultaneously and he would compare the two of them, and that's what a lot of us got from our education in art history. There was a long period of time. It was all because of this guy just saying, this thing looks like this thing, or this thing doesn't look like this thing, and there you go, here's art history. Going back further in time, the first guy to use art history slides is in 1873, is this guy Bruno Mayer. And I can't remember for a fact, but what they used to do, and I'm not sure if it was him, but so this is a magic lantern, and this is one that would allow you to kind of switch between slides. So you'd have one, and then you kind of fade into the other ones, which people thought was pretty amazing in 1873. Why I think this matters is prior to the slide lecture, you had individuals like this who, this is prior to photography, prior to all these kinds of forms of projection, having to make these huge drawings in order to explain, such and such a place in Rome, if you couldn't go on these kind of long, extended journeys, which is totally bizarre. This is another kind of photo play. This was called a photo play. So this happened, Alexander Black, he did this photo play called Miss Jerry, and basically what it was, he would scroll through the images and he would tell this narrative of this person, Miss Jerry. And Miss Jerry, she was basically like a kind of new woman of 1895, who at the end of the photo play gets married to this guy and they live happily ever after and yada yada. But it's interesting to me too because at this time, so 1895, it depends on where you kind of put things, but 1895 is roughly when film started. So, and this guy would also pack auditoriums with this, basically just this slideshow, which is, now we think of it as a totally boring thing, but he would pack them simultaneously when people started watching films. So it was this weird kind of interspace where, film wasn't totally dominant yet, but these slideshows were kind of, were there as well with everything else. And I wonder in all this sort of stuff, why film history isn't talked about more in relation to artist talks. Because you have people like, that you learn about in Film History 101, like Lev Kuleshov. So Lev, basically what he found out is if you put an image up and then you put another image up behind it, your brain wants to connect the two images. So the way that he explained that was he would always have a man, in this case, show an image of a man, cut to an image of a baby, and then you're like, oh, the man, he adores the baby, what a great man. And then it would be, okay, image of a man, cut to a bunch of food, and then the brain thinks, oh my God, that guy's so hungry. We're not super smart all the time. And then an image of a man, and then a lady, and then it was like, oh, that guy's a pervert. And so you kind of connect all these sort of things together. And throughout film history, we use these, but we never, no matter how many slideshows I've seen by artists, I rarely see those two dots connected in that way, although we know this sort of basic fact. I want to show an example of how some of these things can work in a kind of, in a sort of filmic way, of really of just slide after slide after slide, and having the narrative sort of carry everything. So this is a film by Chris Marker. I'm sure some of you have seen this film. And I'm just going to play like 30 seconds or so of it and see if it plays.
This is settled beneath Chaillot in a network of galleries. Above ground in Paris, as in most of the world, everything was rotten with radioactivity. The victors stood guard over a kingdom of rats.
So the basic premise of the film is that it's a post-apocalyptic world, and it's just kind of narrating this story. And it was also that film was the basis for 12 Monkeys later. But what I really love about that is it's just image after image after image after image carried by voice, which I don't think is any different than what I'm doing right now, or what most artist talks tend to be. Not all. I'm going to talk about a few that don't function in that way. Another example of this is Robert Smithson's Hotel Palenque. Again, it was, what would happen is slide after slide after slide would play, and it was sort of like this travelogue. I don't have video of this because as hard as I've tried to get a legal version, I can't find one. But so slide after slide after slide would play, and then over the top would just be the recording of Smithson's voice. And in a similar way with James Coleman, but instead of a bunch of different images playing, it would be the same image that would recur, but new narration over the image. So each time the image itself would change based on his narration. And then, of course, documentary practices and conceptual art. This work by Nan Goldin is really interesting to me, the Ballad of Sexual Dependency. In part because it's really well known as a photo essay, but what it started out was a slideshow, and she would play this slideshow, and she would speak over this slideshow, and it was basically all her friends who were in the area, and it was about her, addictions to love, and their addictions to heroin, and hers as well. And so it was this very kind of personal story that I haven't seen before in other kinds of work like this. Of course, you can't forget about Microsoft PowerPoint being invented in 1990. For whatever reason, slides were dying, and then they invented Microsoft PowerPoint. I don't. But not everyone hates it. David Byrne loves PowerPoint. He has a ton of PowerPoint lectures. He's like obsessive about these things, and they're actually pretty good. And in a broader way, I think these sort of talks have made this weird resurgence. So you have things like Pecha Kucha, or you can say however you want. Mixed taste. So mixed taste came out of, not quite MCA Denver, but it's now attached to MCA Denver. And what it is it's talks on it's tag team talks on disparate topics. So they'll throw together Edgar Allan Poe and me. And then two people come up and one will speak about one thing and one will speak about the other, and then they got to try and figure out some way to relate it. And then of course TED Talks, which seem to be everywhere. And it reminds me of that moment of Alexander Black having all these people around going through a slideshow 150 years ago. It's like, it's kind of this weird cyclical thing that's ended up happening. And then of course things like the nightly news and all the parodies of it feel no different to me than artist talks. It's basically usually a guy and a set of slides that he's running through making fun of, or sometimes videos will pop up. It's the most basic sort of way of speaking to people in terms of moving images. So that's one thread that seems to always have some kind of relation to artist talks. Another one for me is hermeneutics. Now, I don't know if y'all know what that is, and it doesn't really matter, because I'm going to explain it anyway, in my way. So what hermeneutics is, it's a whole philosophical school and a bunch of other things, but basically what it comes down to is it's a mode of interpretation and translation, fundamentally. That's it. So, and why it matters to me, and it sounds like, again, like it's kind of boring thing, but why it matters to me is because hermeneutics has been used for all kinds of different reasons, some of which are really horrible and some of which have changed the course of history. So for example, the Protestant Reformation was fundamentally a question of hermeneutics. It was an interpretation of the Bible, a new kind of interpretation, actually looking back and a re-examining of the old interpretation of the Bible in order to kind of have this new way of living. And this sort of stuff happens all the time. Like if you look at law, for instance, is an extended hermeneutics. It's an extended form of interpretation, usually of law. Or you look at what the far right is in America, and they have a very specific kind of hermeneutics which really demands that the text is whole, the text is completely pure, there is nothing that's left out of the text also comes from God. And anything that's beyond that explodes their minds. But fundamentally, hermeneutics can be traced back to a set of religious practices. This is, I'm sure some of you are familiar, this is the Talmud, which is a Jewish text. And what fascinates me is not necessarily the Talmud in and of itself, but the way that it functions as a hermeneutic text. And here's what I mean. So the Talmud, unlike a lot of the books that we're familiar with, so most books will throw their endnotes and everything at the end. The Talmud, the body of the text for the Talmud is here. All the rest of this is hermeneutics, interpretation. So it's commentaries, it's different glosses, and it's been accumulated since the year 200. And they just keep adding to it, adding, and they carry it along with them in each one of the pages. If I return to this for a second. I actually think as an institution, we also, as a museum, we also look at ourselves as a kind of extended process of hermeneutics. So what do I mean by that? It's kind of like if you were to take the main section and you were to say the main section of this, the kind of core text is the artwork, and every other bit of writing for it is the kind of interpretive bit of writing. And there's a ton of it that we do. So there's the catalog, which is the curator's chance to have their interpretation. There's the press release, which has its own form of language. There are didactics, handouts, tours. You have other people speaking, interpreting this work. And then, of course, what I do, which is programs, which is also another form of, for me, interpretation. So you smash all these things together, and I think this is one way to look at what we do as an institution. And there's a lot of extended arguments that have happened historically about how much hermeneutics you should put in the work. So for instance, if you look at the difference between the Contemporary Art Museum and the Menil will put up title information, but they won't put up any extended didactic text next to the work. And that's a hermeneutic. That's a thing that's fundamentally hermeneutic. For us, we'll put didactics next to it. Now, they got to be really, really small, but they'll still be there. Yeah. So if we just go into programs for just a second, because that's where artist talks get put. So there's all kinds of different programs. I'm not going to talk about a lot of them. But the really obvious ones are artist talks and the curator-critic talk. And artist talks are really weird for me because unlike something like a curator or a critic talk where they're interpreting something else, the artist talk, basically their job is to interpret themselves. And that's also really weird. And that's really weird for me because just thinking about what other spaces we're obliged to interpret ourselves, well, I mean, there's things like, you know, late at night and the person you're with asks you what you're thinking. But there's also much more serious ones, like, for example, acts of confession, where you have to go through in your mind and look at all the different kinds of sin that you've taken part in. Actually, a lot of, confession has roots in practices of monks, and basically the deal with the monks is that they were supposed to constantly train their mind to be sort of loving of God, to be thinking of God. And any kind of deviance of that, which happened all the time because we're human, some monk wanting to sleep with another monk, whatever it was, you had to remove that, and then a lot of times you had to confess that, and you had to actually talk about that all the frickin' time. And then when you're standing accused of court, you're also required to talk about your memories, to interpret your actions, your motivations. And if you've ever been psychoanalyzed, they'll ask you the same kinds of things. So it's very strange that in these kinds of practices, Freudian practices, juridical practices, religious practices, they all ask you to interpret yourself. And then artist talks too, they also ask you to interpret yourself. And why it got smashed in there is really peculiar. A lot of what I was talking about just a second ago in relation to hermeneutics, a lot of that stuff can be found in Foucault. He had a set of lectures that he did a couple of years. It was some of the later lectures he did right before he passed. But he talks about there's a whole history of these different kinds of processes that changed from, when people, the time of the Stoics to religious practices, on and on and on and on and on and on. And then Judith Butler, who makes some great commentaries on that. Part of the reason why I'm interested in all that, though, too, is there was a whole set of artists in the 60s and 70s who basically rejected any sense of self. So when they asked them to kind of talk about their work, talk about who they were, talk about their influences, they refused that in every possible way. As a for example of that, Robert Morris did this talk in 1967. It's called 21.3. And what he did, they asked him, he got a show at the Guggenheim, a retrospective, and they asked him to give an artist talk on, what he does, his history, et cetera, et cetera. So instead of doing that, he recorded a portion of an art historical book by Panofsky, and he just played that, and then he tried to mime it the whole time that the thing was playing behind him. Obviously it pissed off a ton of people. Because basically here's this guy who's supposed to explain everything that he's been doing, and he refused to do it. And I think part of that refusal is he refused to partake in this kind of self-analysis. He didn't want to do it. And with Morris, it's really interesting because if you look at his practice, which jumps from minimalism to the very overt forms of sexuality, which he got dinged for in many different ways by the right, he kept it bouncing around. He didn't quite have a full... his artistic practice wasn't this kind of consistent thing. He didn't allow that kind of sense of self to appear. And fundamentally, that sort of work was also performative. And I think, you know, as a thing, artist talks are always performative. I think there's no way in which it's not performative. I mean, I think even what I'm doing right now is performative. Whether or not, you know, it gets acknowledged every single time, I think it is. I think there's a way that, you know, even in the really straightforward ones, you're performing you're kind of performing knowledge is what you're doing. So you're performing, oh, I know about this thing, and then I know about this thing, and I know about this thing, and then oh, look at me, I'm so smart. I think that's always the case. And there's a huge range of other kinds of performative avenues that artists have taken. So for instance, Andrea FRASER in 2001 did this work called Opening Welcome, or Official Welcome. It's Official Welcome, not Opening Welcome. And she was getting an award, and so they wanted her to talk about this. So instead of doing that, what she did was she took the speeches of, I don't know how many artists, a number of different artists, and she just repeated those speeches. So it's on and on and on about how great everyone is and how lovely her mother was, and then eventually she got naked because, you know, you're a performance artist, so you got to get naked. And but it's super jarring. You can find the full thing on Web, and you can find a commentary on that on the Power Plant. Actually recorded a lecture of her talking about that, which I think is quite good. And then I think there are also practices that have infiltrated in other kinds of ways as performative practices. So Jason Mewson, who the museum showed before I was a part of the museum, had this series called Art Thoughts, and it was basically he was talking about, in this really comedic way, different kinds of art practices, art historical practices. But he would do this as this character, Hennessy Youngman, which was this like totally stereotyped kind of hip hop character, and they're super funny. But I think they definitely play into this broader performative aspect of artist talk. Of course, Mel Chin, who we're showing right now, has a number of different kinds of performative artist talks, lecture acts. He made all kinds of sculptures relating to these, lecture acts being one of them. And then also kind of going back to this question of, you know, that a lot of artists have asked about who the subject is. There was a moment in this artist's work where Wöhlflin, who pretended he was this fictional organization looking to recoup the history of, I believe, Liberia. And he called it the Atlas Group. And he gave a number of different talks at prominent art institutions, the Walker, et cetera, where he unloaded his archive of this history. And all of it was made up. And you can find these online. But it was a total performance of even what an institution could be. It was a very strange kind of thing. Nathaniel, who we also had at the museum, who I think there are a number of different ways in which he engages in performance. I think he has a talk coming up. Do you have a talk coming up, Nathaniel? What's your date for your talk?
May 7th, Central Track.
May 7th. All right. Be there. All right. Yeah. And then the last thing I think that this all connects to is pedagogy, because fundamentally what they're asking artists to do is to teach everyone about themselves, about their practice. And there's a whole history of artists having to do that and dealing with that in different ways. The most obvious one, of course, is Joseph Beuys, whose teachings were simultaneously performances, and whose any object associated with his teaching were also sculptures or artwork. So you have these marathon 3-4 hour long talks that he would do, writing like a madman on the chalkboard, and these chalkboards would be slowly taken away by the galleries to be sold instantaneously. So a really, really crazy thing. It's really bizarre. So I'm also interested in the way, if you look at, behind BEUYS, he has this diagram, and he constantly used diagrams, and they weren't always so explicit, but he used them to communicate a lot of what he was thinking. And every now and again you can find these things in art history. Alfred Barr, for instance, who was really responsible for MoMA becoming what it was in the early 20th century. He did this diagram explaining the development of abstract art, which is not at all accurate as a thing, but I think is a really interesting teaching tool.
Sure.
There's all kinds of examples of this. Mark Lombardi, who is also a CAM staff member, oddly enough, secret CAM staff. But what I'd say is some artists are very good about being pedagogical, and I don't think artists need to be pedagogical. But I think other disciplines are a lot better with explaining themselves. Science is a lot better with explaining themselves. But more than any of them, I think design disciplines are really, really good at explaining what it is they do. And it totally makes sense because you have, for instance, a building that's going to cost, well, this is not always the case, there's a lot of other kinds of art, but for instance, you would have a building that would cost $100 million, and you have to explain it to a client who knows nothing about the history of architecture. How are you going to do that? And they're tremendously good at doing that, the really, really big ones. This is one of my favorite diagrams. This is one that Jamal Cyrus made for a catalog that we did for Robert Hodge. And it explains the influences of Robert Hodge in the form of a diagram, but the diagram is actually a circuit of a drum machine. So he took the circuit of the drum machine, and then he added everything in there, from the archives to Snoop Dogg to, it's totally across the map. But I think it makes sense for Robert's practice, and I also think it makes sense for Jamal. Jamal's local. And this is not a very good image, but every now and again it'll sneak into philosophy too. You'll have these diagrams that appear in philosophy. This is from the introduction to the reading of Hegel. And what Alexander does is he explains eternity, concept, and time in 11 figures in relation to a number of different philosophers stretching from Plato to Hegel. And he condenses it all in these little circles, and I think it's fantastic. And I really, really, really wish that artists would do more things like this. Not even to totally explain everything that they do, but just as a kind of for instance. And jumping back to design here, or architecture. Architects are diagrams have become a huge part of what architecture is. And I think it's helpful not just within the discipline, but it's helpful for people to understand what the hell it is that they're talking about. So you have a very complicated thing. For instance, this was done by OMA. It's very famous, Seattle Public Library. And it's the diagram associated with it. And it kind of breaks down the different sort of programs. So you have assembly here, you got the store here, you got the parking here, and it's very easy to understand all these sort of complex operations that are happening within that. I'm going to pop out of this and pop into one that I really, 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 really like. So this is big, and they had to explain this complex, which was this huge multi-million-dollar complex. A lot of different programs, a lot of different activities happening in it. And they did it in this really amazing, simple, diagrammatic way. So just thinking of the building, this is how big the building is. These are all the programs, so the different colors mean, okay, this is happening there. It could be a store, it could be living, it could be da-da. This is kind of how it functions. What if instead of that, we started stacking them? Oh, and then there's a square over there, so we'll go ahead and pinch it. And then, you know, we have the sun, so we have to squash things so people can see the sun, because people need to see the sun. And then we also need views like that, because you don't want to just see the other side of the building. And that's why they did the building. And now that's not totally the reason why they did the building, but as a diagram, you know, I could explain the building to a 5-year-old. And it's very, now of course there's archy speak and all this kind of stuff, and there's art speak, but I don't understand why we don't use some of these things in our own practice. So, yeah, that's kind of the long and short of things. So, thank you for listening to me, and special thanks to all of the people. I don't know if anyone has questions. I'm more than happy to explain myself. All right. I'll be here. Of course.